So we are quite cozy. So you can also come closer. And I would suggest that if you have remarks or questions while I'm talking, you feel free to intervene. Yeah. So disruption. Well, data standards have become disruptive just as the absence of roads would be disruptive if you moved from horse and carriage to Ferraris. You have horse and carriage, that works very well on the old pathways there were, but now you take a Ferrari with ground clearance of 10 centimeters, you try to drive it on that, it won't work. That disrupts all the work you do on your mechanics. And I'll invite you to join me on a little bit of a warm-up. So first, let's look at us, the human. And here I take the help of Richard Dawkins, famous biologist. He suggested that we live in a kind of middle world. We perceive things in the middle. We only perceive light waves in the middle. We don't perceive ultraviolet, X-rays. We don't perceive the longer wave, so infrared and so on. Same for sound. Same for timescales. A bullet that would travel through this room, our eyes wouldn't perceive, it goes too fast. The tectonic shifts we don't perceive, they go too slowly. And the number of objects we can handle at a time is a very crippling limitation. There are even populations where the counting goes 1, 2, 3, many. Not us here, but that exists. So that has been given to us as a consequence of evolution. That's what mankind needed, people needed to survive in the times our species has been formed. And we are still equipped with that today, where we face a very different age. Now let's look at perception. This, some of you might recognize, is Iguazu, just water, turbulent waves. Now Miss A watches that. The light comes into the eyes, conceives something, projects it, a wave, has a representation of that, gives it a name, and produces some science, language, etc. to represent it. Mr. A then, with that representation in his head, meets Mrs. B, who sees and reads all these signs he produced and who listens to Mr. A describing that wave. And then Mrs. B will create a representation in her head. God knows what she will have in her head then. And if you describe a glass of water, that might still give something on the other person's mind that is fairly similar to what you meant. But if it's an immaterial object, it becomes a bit more complicated. And here we're already pretty close to data. Yeah. So the conversations we look at can be summarized by this. Human to human, we exchange words. If my words are not clear, you ask, what did you mean with that? And I explain. Machines exchange data. Machines don't ask questions. If data is unclear, either they crash or they continue producing something. And you take that something that comes out. Say if you're a pilot in an airplane, an automatic pilot, if the data that comes in doesn't fit your instruments and you don't watch out, your plane will crash, as happened in Indonesia recently. That conversation was like this in the past. We had mostly human-to-human conversation. The medium was passive. It didn't talk. Today it's the other way around. That is what technology has given to us. Most of data being processed, most of information being processed in the world today goes within computers or between computers. We just watch over it. And we have very little influence on what's happening inside there. So now let's look at the economy and finance. I distinguish here, to make things clear, 2 layers, the human layer and the technical layer. Now the human layer, that's us. Here we find people, we find sovereigns, so the British sovereign, the French, US, etc. We trade, we make agreements, behaviors result from those agreements. For instance, my employment contract makes that I get up in the morning and go to work. That's a behavior. We do all these things. We work, earn, spend, invest, consume. This is all governed by law and politics, and it's fragmented in sovereign territories. The contract builds a link to the technical layer. So it is represented, documented. That's the agreement documented on paper, traditionally, or on data, more lately. That technical layer is then processed, there's execution happening, there is bureaucracy. Okay. Now, that bureaucracy has been profoundly changed by technologies, networked computers. At the human layer, what we get as humans also is identity, security, stability. We have a stable world on which we can rely, and we are used to geography and law and cultures being segmented by countries. We also see the British economy, the French economy, the US economy, etc. That's how also our lawyers will look at it. That's how the statisticians at the ECB look at it. That's how economic analysts look at it. That's how financial stability people look at it. They have the French financial system, the Euro area financial system, etc. Underneath, everything has changed. We have moved from passive medium to active medium. So paper is passive. Paper only has an influence when someone looks at it, thinks, makes a decision, and acts. And in a bureaucratic environment, that action is usually producing another piece of paper, putting on it a stamp and a signature, and sending it to the next person who will read it, and so on. Data, the medium is active. Data in a computer, an algorithm, or some kind of software transforms it. It triggers action, possibly through chains of computers. Many of these chains can come together in one computer that triggers something else. You have flash crashes. It's only computers talking to each other. Happens in 20 minutes, is over, and it takes 6 months of inquiry to have a first suspicion. So we tend to be lost in that conversation that happens in active media. That integration happens beyond sovereign territories. When Lehman went down, it didn't seem to care for national borders. It moves on fast with technology. So every year brings its new fad. At the moment, it's AI and machine learning. Already on the horizon, we see quantum computing coming up. And every one of these new fads brings us more computing power, more speed, and more networking. So this world is becoming automated pretty fast, pretty deep, and far beyond our capacity to control. And that's then the question that comes up. How do we stay in control of that system? Now, we have a real-world system. I'm an engineer. I'd like to look at systems. Yeah? The real-world system includes all of us. We need to measure it. Then we use that measurement to analyze. We need it. We need the analysis to understand what's going on so that we can act, and that influences the real world. In practice, and that gives us control. In practice, everyone does that all the time. If we go back to Dawkins, our eyes see live whether a lion or a wolf is popping up behind the next tree. And so they see it at the scale and speed of the system that is relevant to us. If we see it early enough, we can climb on a tree because our analysis tells us that lion is hungry, he will eat me, so I better climb now. So we need to be alert to see things early enough, fast in the way we produce the information. So I don't need information about the presence of that lion 10 minutes later when the statistician tells me, hey, my statistics 10 minutes ago tell me that there was some kind of biological mass behind that tree. It's a lion, he eaten me since. It needs to be precise enough, and we need then, once we come to conclusions, we need to be fit enough to act. Now let's just take a little excursus through military doctrine. In the US, the Pentagon issued a directive in 2012 that said there will be a human in the loop whenever it's about shooting. So a drone over some country will only shoot a rocket if someone pushes the button. Now, what when the war involves a lot of systems, Say, for instance, you're a fighter pilot, you're surrounded by 20 other planes, you don't know because they're so far away, they're so fast, you don't know which one is enemy, which one is friend. You're having all kinds of devices that are getting at you, electronic disturbance by some countermeasures, you have rockets being shot at you from the floor, from the planes. Which button do you push and when to make sure you get out of this? Well, that's the question other people at the Pentagon have asked themselves. In DARPA, there is an office called the OTC, Office of, OSC, Office of Strategic Technology. And they have come up with a concept, so warfare in the next 30, 40 years, call it mosaic warfare. An orchestrated multitude of systems overwhelm the enemy by creating a range of simultaneous dilemmas in multiple domains. That means that this one is perhaps valid today, human in the loop, but with technology racing ahead, will we be able to keep it up? Will we be able, in that big box, computer to computer, to understand well enough what's going on so that we can stay in control and we can have an influence on what's happening? That here, mosaic warfare, that's the kind of situation that fighter pilot I described before is facing. Many dilemmas. If I go down, I'll be shot by this one. If I go up, I'll be shot by that one. And in finance, we're about there as well. Except that in finance, we didn't need an enemy. We did it to ourselves. We built all these systems. Every bank management group goes out and buys the latest technology and tries to make a killing in the market with it. And all these things interact in the markets. So we need to look at measurement first. Now, the biggest problem we face is measurement. When Lehman went down, measurement was the biggest problem. We didn't know, and you didn't know, who was exposed how to that accident. And had we known faster, both the authorities and the private sector, there would have been less panic in the markets. The markets wouldn't have frozen as they did, which created a lot of problems that would not have been necessary. I would say today we are a bit better, but still not good enough, by far not. So as an engineer, you think of specifications. What specifications do we need for measurement? Well, we need measurement to work at the scale and speed of the system, and that, like it or not, in finance is global real time. It's a tall order, but we can also put our head in the sand. Analysis needs to be flexible, fast enough to address surprises, because we are living in a complex system, and a complex system, by definition, it will always surprise you, because it doesn't fit one head. If there was no surprise possible, it would mean you figured it out, so we wouldn't need to be sitting here. Next bunch of specification that comes from there. Well, we will need to analyze system level directly from granular data, because the reality, the macro reality, is made of micro, and if we don't understand what's happening at micro, we won't understand what's happening at macro. And that's one simple property of turbulence. You can calculate the aerodynamics of a wing very simply, as long as one layer of air can be assumed to glide on the next layer of air. That's equations a 15-year-old can solve. I did it in that day. But as soon as turbulence comes in, you need very large-scale computer systems. That means very large-scale granular data. It needs to be collected near time if we want to have these first two. That again means that the data needs to come directly from operational systems to analytical systems. Otherwise, we're too slow. We need a fully automated chain from reality through measurement to analysis to be able to implement these things. That means data needs to be standardized globally, identifiers first. So, as Swapnil said, I spent the last 12 years working on what's now the LEI system. It took a few years first to get the attention of people at a higher level. I was lucky that Jean-Claude Trichet, at the time president of the ECB, is an engineer by education, so he got it at once. So identifiers need to be standardized. You go to a supermarket, every yogurt pod has a barcode. It makes it so easy. You scan, the people in finance, in marketing, in procurement, in logistics, they all have your data at once, and their processes work. In finance, it's not that way. I mean, I was very, very surprised when I came to financial data 12 years ago to see the mess it is, with all due respect. And I understand why. In physical industries, you can't get it wrong because it shows immediately and it costs money at once. In finance, you can survive for a long time by fudging the issue, simply because it's immaterial, people don't see. And there is enough money being made. So, if you want these things to work, you also need operational data standardized at sufficient depth across all systems in the market. And finally, we will also need to consider at some point moving to have all contracts represented in a single universal algorithmic language. When we are there, then we will be able to have all this IT, so this wonderful information technology, give its full potential and safely, because we can control it. It's a long shot. Now, I chose in my last year, when I did my engineering studies, in the last year of Specialized, I chose new materials. The consideration was that every age of mankind has started with the mastery of a new class of materials. Now we're in a digital age. How are we going to master data? At the moment, we don't. It's mastering us, and we run big risks. So, first, I thought long about what data actually is, and data is nothing else than language. We compress language, we powder it so that it fits into a computer. So data is to language what powdered milk is to milk. Now we are human, we have very diverse languages. I think at the moment there are something like 6,000 languages spoken in the world, and probably at least a dozen or more spoken in this room, if you want. But computers don't like that diversity. They like it homogeneous. So, data has become an obstacle. Data has become disruptive simply because it didn't move along with the needs of our technology base. And all these things happen all the time, and more connection among more people, but also among organizations, countries, jurisdictions, etc. Lots of people who don't care about computers, but now they're thrown into one system. So that increased social complexity because we work with people from completely different cultures. Across one of your banks with your thousands of legal entities across the world, you will work with people at the other end of the world who code things differently. So that diversity makes the agreement on standards more difficult and more necessary, more urgent, and at the same time much more difficult to achieve. Because we need to agree among many more different cultures now. So the data Tower of Babel is here, and I think it's pretty safe to say that adding more technology will only deliver value when data becomes better. At the moment, adding more technology creates more cost. It adds more layers to that layer cake. I mean, the bottom layers, the last programmers died, so we don't even dare to touch it anymore. There are many banks. People tell me, oh, if we disconnect it, we don't know where it has ramifications. So it makes it very difficult to change things. So we can't boil the ocean. That problem, I mean, 12 years ago already, I realized that's an ocean of a problem. It's global, it's deep, and it's growing bigger by the day. So we can't solve it in the way that we would now devise a solution. We will all agree, the UN agrees, and we develop it. We push a button, roll it out to the world, and everyone is happy and it works. That's why we need to take a different approach. And if you look at other transformations that have happened, and I've been lucky to be in the automotive industry. I mean, it's a Chinese curse. I lived interesting times wherever I went. In the automotive industry as well, I lived through the most brutal change. When I joined Mercedes in '86, it was a solid 100-year-old company. Everything had been invented. They selected only the very best of the best. And the advice I got as a young engineer, don't try to improve it, just work hard. 10 years later, the whole industry had changed most radically. And it had changed not because there was a grand plan, but because some disruptive change happened that had transformational power. And within 10 years, that industry was transformed from an oligopoly of highly integrated manufacturers with a cloud of suppliers around, into a matrix with much leaner manufacturers and giant suppliers that had grown in few years through capital market activity. For instance, GM and Ford pushed out their whole components universe to the market. GM named it Delphi, Ford named it Visteon, and then came very big investors who said, okay, I want to build the global seats manufacturer, and another one, the dominant manufacturer for alternators and so on. And that reconfigured the whole system. Now, standardization is often at the heart of such processes because it creates scale where there was no scale before. Now, when scale comes in, all of a sudden you have economies of scale, age-old rule, that make it worth investing, make it worth doing things differently. And a few of these standards that have changed our world, well, you have the barcode, I mentioned it, business English. No, otherwise I could be talking to you, but you wouldn't understand my French. Shipping container. Here I recommend Mark Levinson's book called The Box, subtitle that made the world markets larger and the world smaller. And time and date. We have forgotten about that, but that's a couple of centuries old now. But it's a global standard as well. Even though some countries have their own traditional calendar still, but business is done in the same global calendar. So now data ecosystems have changed. That I will not repeat again. The relevant data ecosystem is now global. Now everything has coalesced gradually as networks went deeper and denser. That means that our data standards in finance, at least the core data standards, must be global. I said that it's vital. Why do we need them? Well, I mean, the businesses out there need to reduce their cost and risk. And we, at the ECB and in the other public sector institutions, we need to be able to get all that data from all over the place, bring it together at ever more granular level in order to be able to measure what's going on. Just measure and then analyze. So now there has long been a debate about whether these standards should be left to emerge, as standards have always done, or whether, as I always say, we need to have them imposed by law. If you leave it to market forces alone, well, a bank will have an interest in adjusting their systems to, for instance, build on the LEI, only when they know that the LEI is going to be generalized, that every customer will have to have an LEI. Then you know it. You know it's worth it. If you don't know that, then you can't invest on hope, simply on hope, and perhaps in 20 years there will be payback. So what will you do? You will wait for the others to do it first. The rational approach is follower. And standards that are left in that situation will end up in a low adoption, low value corner. So we need to go faster than that, also because technology is progressing and even accelerating. How can we do that? Well, the LEI system has illustrated what leadership is needed. We were lucky in the early days to be able to meet people who took it serious at a very high level. And so we had access to the Financial Stability Board and the G20, and they accepted to take the step. And what's remarkable is that we went to the G20 with the first proposal on the 4th of November 2011. And the charter that founds the LEI system was endorsed by the G20 1 year later. And in that year, the charter was written in a group of public sector people like me from institutions all over the world, 55 of us, supported by an industry advisory group of 400 members, all volunteers. We had one big conference in Basel where we discussed some fundamentals, and then we went about to work. And within a year, the thing was born. That's the first level of leadership, global leadership. That has worked. The second level we now need is at national level to make this thing into an infrastructure. Just last Thursday, I was at a conference in Frankfurt where a colleague from ESMA said that the LEI is a great success. And I said, well, on one level I contradict this. Well, yes, it is a success. It's a global infrastructure that is controlled by no single sovereign, because it can't be a global infrastructure. It's public-private. It works. It has 1.3 million legal entities registered, but in the EU alone, there are probably closer to 100 million legal entities. So now we are at the point where 10% or 5% of the objects in the supermarket have a barcode. You still stand in the queue at the checkout because people buy other things as well. So that leadership we still need to mobilize. And I think, so you might be of a different opinion, but if there is no law, it won't move. I'll give you an example. Smoking. Our children are now around 20. When they were babies, we could not go to certain places because people were smoking in an ice cream parlor, in a restaurant. Never mind whether there were children around. You always had people smoking in those days. Then came law. Smoking banned in all public places. Hey, that made a change. Nowadays, no one would think of smoking in a public place, because it would be ostracized by everyone else. So social norms have shifted. And social norms can shift without legislation, but then they shift very slowly. They will shift much faster if there is law made on a no-brainer. And that's where we need to go. So now the vision on what the whole system would look like. First vision, it's coming back to my first slides, that has to do with perception, the way we see the world, what images we project on it. And to give an example, that's a solar system, heliocentric, and that's a solar system, geocentric. We all agree on that one. People have been burned for saying that this is not helpful. We should better do that, because in those days, 500 years ago, everyone wanted to see this way. Now, both are wrong, because the center of the sun is not the center of the system. The whole system rotates around its center of gravity, but it forms all the time. So it's not easy to say what is the center. It moves all the time. Doesn't matter. It's more useful than this. And we need to have a theory of what our world looks like, because otherwise we can't observe, we can't handle it, we can't discuss it, we can't exchange on it. And we don't need to dispute on the visions, because they all have their merits. And here I like to quote Hans Poser. He is a very old, 83, 84-year-old professor in Berlin, technology and philosophy he teaches. And he says, well, don't dispute it. Combine the visions. It gives you more possibilities. And so we need a new vision of the technical substance of the markets. The human layer might have changed as well with globalization, but what's much more important to look at for the moment for us is the technical layer. Global reach for all, speed, data volumes, complexity. So one way to look at it is to say, well, the economy is nothing else than a global network of contracts that connect a global population of agents. And to bring it back to the classical view, yes, every agent is anchored in a legal system, and every contract is anchored in a legal system. And there are some people, perhaps in this room, highly paid to make sure that you have your agents placed in the right jurisdictions and you connect them properly so that at the end of the day, you don't need to pay taxes, you can shift your profits wherever you want, and so on. That's fair game, but it shows that the legal system or the patchwork of legal systems is not adequate for the challenges we face. So, now, combining the visions. At the human level, you will still see this as being relevant. Closed systems, national economies with perturbations between, such as international trade and investment. Statistics, you have national account statistics, you have balance of payment statistics for the perturbations, and international investment position statistics, and so on. But at the technical layer, it makes much more sense to adopt that vision. And that will help us to reconcile human diversity and technical unity that we have at the bottom layer. For instance, today, infrastructures, data infrastructures exist. In France, for instance, we have the ideal system, Code Sirène, run by INSEE, the National Statistical Institute. Every legal entity in France has a Code Sirène. Makes it easy. It's not always well maintained. That's another question of social norms. The social norm in digital age should be that public institution will maintain the reference data on these entities in real time, not once a year, as was good 100 years ago. So here we have all these classical things, but all these needs to be built up from that consideration. And if you have the data fitting that, you can build up all these from it. Yeah, you pull the node of the sovereign, out come all the citizens, all the legal entities of that country, all contracts between them. That's your national economy. You look at all the contracts between one of these members of the population of that sovereign and someone else. You have your balance of payments. And exposure, you have an accident on Lehman Inc. You have the whole contractual footprint of Lehman Inc. that will be affected. For instance, CDS contracts triggered. AIG issued them. AIG needs to pay 250 billion. Whoops, AIG goes down. All the other contracts, AIG are affected. Many banks go down. Disaster. So if you had known that before making the decision on Lehman, it would have been helpful, because Hank Paulson rang up his wife that night and said, "Darling, pray for us. We don't know what we're doing." He wrote that in his memoirs, so I trust it's true. Then they would have known what they were going to do, and they might have made another decision. So what do we need to standardize? In a physical world, it's much easier because we know what you talk about. The objects are there for each one of us to touch. In a world of immaterial objects, we need to find out what is real. And here the motor is law. Law makes things real. Law creates social consensus about a legal entity. If you have an idea, so my son had a little business when he was 12. He collected empty bottles, brought them back to the kiosk, collected 25 cents per bottle. It was more than his pocket money. But he never registered that business, so it was never real for society. Had he registered it, it would have been real for society, because German law would have said, okay, now Darcy, you have a business, you need to pay taxes and to fill this form and so on. And immediately that business would have been real for the whole world, at least wherever the sovereign recognized the German sovereign. So law is the motor of social consensus, and it makes abstract objects into a fact for all globally. So fact can be given identification and representation. So that can be a data sheet, paper, photo, whatever. And identification and representation of a party or a contract must now be digital in the digital age. It's useless to have that stuff on paper somewhere in a closet, or for instance have it on paper even if it's distributed to all. Take a simple prospectus of a government bond, plain vanilla instrument. At the ECB, I built up the centralized securities database. That's a database that contains data on around 15 million securities, equities and fixed interest. And I was surprised. I thought there was an official register for these things, yeah, as naive as I was. But I was put in charge of that, and no, we buy data on the market from the same vendors as you all. And we have to buy data from many vendors because we need full coverage, and none of them has all. That means you get data on a German government bond from each one of the vendors. And each one tells you a different story. Use different identifiers, use different definitions for same terms, use different terms for same definitions, has different states of maintenance. You don't know what's true. The only way to know what's true is to go back to the prospectus, to the job again. Some people do that, and then they sell it in the market, and they add to the problem. Others clean the data, sell it on the market, and add to the problem. We don't sell it, but we have the problem too. And so we need digital representation, and that digital representation must be unique. Created once, and everyone goes and picks up the information there. Then many things get much simpler. Yeah, that way as we had. So law makes legal entity into a fact for all globally, and it should also mandate global identification representation unique in a standardized infrastructure. So what could an architecture look like? Well, you have an object that is made fact by law. You give it a digital twin that's mandated by national law, stored in a global public good data infrastructure. Now, the blueprint is the LEI system. LEI system is global, not under the control of any sovereign. But say the EU, I hope we'll get there, that the EU would issue a directive that would say every legal entity registered in a state of the European Union will have to have an LEI. And okay, I've said that. The global LEI system is now operational. It's waiting to be used for that. And we would then continue. I mean, legal entities are only one kind of objects. That is fact by law. Contracts are another one. Yeah. So we would need to first learn with that implementation. It will create benefits, and that will create demand for more. The slides will be made public now. Now, what would the complete system look like? That's what we're going to close with. I named this the mechanical skeleton because 2008, Tricia came to my division and asked us, give me the exposures of all euro area residents to layman, and with your big database. Yeah, but it didn't work. But then I realized that the impact was mechanical. It didn't need human panic to create the problem. It was just unfolding consequences of contracts stemming from that one accident. So there is a mechanical part in the system, and it has a skeleton. Inside all this world of human interchange and passion and the animal spirits and people trading, trying to outfox each other, which will always be the game. But there is a mechanical skeleton in it that's made up of parties that are defined, again, by law and contracts. So each one of us is a legal entity. Yeah? Just to understand that, well, we all wear our legal costume, my passport, my contracts. If I'm washed up on the shore of a foreign country where I don't speak the language, I'm just a human animal. And they will treat me according to perhaps human rights, but I'm no one. I can't buy a telephone, I can't rent a flat, I can't buy a car, I can't get a job. I will be able to do all these things the moment I have my legal costume. I'm given my identity by the sovereign. Then other people will know how to trade with me. So the parties will also have to include humans at some point. Parties need identification, LEI, digital representation. Contracts need identification, digital representation. Here, just a short remark. ISIN code is not enough. Let me take Daimler. The ISIN of Daimler is a representation of a population of 1 billion contracts, because Daimler has 1 billion shares outstanding. And I hold a few shares from my old days there, and each one of those is an individual contract I have with Daimler. It's the same algorithm in each contract, but it's each one an individual contract. And that's not saying we need to go down to the level of the contract is not new. It's actually the oldest form. In the past, when you had 20 shares of a company, you had 20 paper certificates, and each year to get your dividend, you had to cut a coupon and go to the bank with it. We just went to that compression because pen on paper is expensive to handle, and in early days of IT, storage was expensive. So we came to the solution, let's compress it, and we have stuck to that habit, and we're still sticking to that habit, although it's become obsolete in the world of blockchain. Yeah, okay, that's a little detail. But so we need to move from that digital twin, so a representation, digital representation of something that's actually mainly represented on paper, a contract that's legally binding on paper, but data vendors or whoever else produce a digital twin. We need to move to the next stage where the data and the algorithm are the contract, legally binding. You want it on paper, you can have a printout, but the algorithm is legally binding. And that, to work, must be done in a standardized, rigorous, machine-compatible language. under a general standard that's valid across a wide range of contract types. Why that? Because, as I said before when I talked about the specifications for measurement, reality has all types of contracts interacting. If you want to understand reality, we need to model it as it is. So we will need to load all types of contracts into a single machine. The machines are now big enough to do that. Then we can understand the interactions between the various types of contracts at the level of the contract. Not try to guess what happens in reality by taking the aggregates from one silo, the aggregates of another silo, the aggregates of another silo. That will never work anymore. So what we need to invent is, well, we have the zeros and ones of software. Every piece of software, at the bottom, the language is zeros and ones. Perhaps that will change when quantum computing comes up. But for contract algorithms, we will need something a bit more complex, so see it as a Lego set. Yeah, some of us might have played with Lego when we were small, and you can build wonderfully different things with the same old bricks. So I don't know how many Lego bricks there will be in that set. It doesn't matter. It will be a finite number. There is one project that has looked into this, and that's already produced some results. It's called ACTUS. ACTUS stands for Algorithmic Contract Type Unified Standard. The people who created that, they're based in Switzerland and the US. They started from the idea that, so they only looked at financial contracts. A financial contract is ultimately an exchange of cash flows. So it is an algorithm that determines who pays how much to whom, when, under what circumstances. Now I thought about, well, being driven by that need to have all contract types covered by one language. How do we generalize this to goods and services? Well, that's how it works. You have an algorithm that's driven by events, and that says which party pays how much to whom. So for instance, a loan, the first of the month is an event. If it happens, 1,000 euro flow from that party to that other party, cash flow. Now, if you look at goods, so contracts for goods, you have an asset. Well, instead of having cash flow, you have an asset transfer. If you go very, very much to the root, an asset also is a contract. Your house is your house because you have a title deed, and the title deed is a contract between you and the sovereign that says that this is your house, not someone else's house. So the asset transfer will simply be a change in that contract. Mr. Smith instead of Mr. So-and-so. Services was something that eluded me a long time, but it became very clear at some point. So if the contract is you scratch my back, I pay you $5. Well, the scratch my back is an event. So it's just a type of event. Now, if we take this concept, and we see what infrastructures we need to build. Well, we have the algorithms, we have real-world events, contract events, market events, human events, decisions. Yeah, people make decisions in contracts, and services that drive algorithms, that deliver cash flows, and the cash flows can then be collected, let's say, in a blockchain. That gives us measurement and statistics. If you have all cash flows, you have all state of all accounts, you can derive all your statistics quasi in real time if the data is there in real time. You can also build on that simulations. And simulations will be fed by scenarios that you connect to these events. Now, to be able to do that, you need a ledger of parties. So LEI system is there to be used, to be filled. You need a ledger of contracts. Each algorithm will need to be registered there. You need a ledger of events. So here, this remains to be designed, but at least all contracts referenced, all events referenced in contracts need to be registered there. You want to represent asset flows, you need a ledger of assets. And with that, you have your data infrastructure. Now, easy events will be dates. So for instance, at the ECB, we build this big unaccredited system. You might have heard of it. And contracts, so loan contracts are simple contracts. So it could be, for instance, one way of starting this by saying, okay, I mean, we don't start with pole vaulting, etc., full speed with a 12-year-old. We learn to jump in much simpler situations. I'm an athletics coach on the side. We would do the same here, and then we learn from that. Now, what architecture would that be if you take one step back? We would have that shared data infrastructure. Industry would conduct its operations using that data, and the authorities would exert their functions using that same data. So when you have some onboarding to do of a client, you know that in that data infrastructure, you find the official truth in real time. That makes a lot of work much simpler. If you exchange data with others, you know that you refer to exactly the same party, the same contract, the same asset. Why? Because these objects that exist really, they are identified here. And you want to have an update, well, you basically register there, and you will be sent any update in real time into your systems. So we could start thin. And as industry structures evolve, because what I see happening is that if this thing comes about, as it grows, you will have scale coming to certain types of operations, and all of a sudden you will have banks saying, hey, we have this subscale, substandard operation in our cellar. It's costing us a lot of money. It's not working very well, and you have the same, and you have the same. Should we create some utility and push it out to the market, fend for themselves? That has happened in many other industries. Yeah. So that's transformational power. Yeah. And ultimately, the last slide, well, you have your operations in the financial sector. We have our job to do to make sure that all together we stay in control of the system, that the system is stable, and we don't do that to oppress the traders and the bankers, but we would like to see that you're able to continue your business day in, day out without disruption to yourselves and to society. So we are again in the same situation, shared data infrastructure. Well, that would guarantee better and safer operations in industry. And it would also enable machine executable reporting. Much, much easier. System to system, automated, near to real time. Much cheaper and better. Automated compliance perhaps someday. Machine, so computer says no, can't do that. For that we need to build a sound data infrastructure, and that is a public mission. Yeah? And sound data infrastructure actually gives more freedom. Like having good roads gives you more freedom. You can drive wherever you want. Yeah. But there needs some discipline. There are the rules of the road to be respected. Otherwise, if we didn't have roads, we didn't have rules of the road, people would drive through your garden because they want to go to that place on the other side. You would drive to other people's garden. At some point, they would shoot you. Yeah. That doesn't work. And here, I mean, luckily, meanwhile, at the ECB, my boss speaks up publicly for that as well. And he found out that resembles a lot the old Ordnungspolitik that made the strength of the Western Germany 49 when it was created. The philosophy is a very simple one. There were a couple of economic thinkers who said, well, let's put in place in the constitution of the country a very simple set of rules, very clear, giving a big frame within which markets can do their thing. Yeah. That's the goal. And then perhaps one day we will have smart regulation that works at the speed we need it. Thank you.
Fascinating.
Okay.
Oh, I'm loud enough.
I think the video is on.
Thank you very much. Fascinating insight, I guess. Is this on? It is on. I'm looking at from a data point of view. I see precisely LEI. I guess probably everybody in this room has been dealing with LEI over the last couple of years with MiFID II. If you look at the history to an extent around data and trying to get it better and trying to standardise that from a global point of view, from America, qualified intermediary became FATCA, became a common reporting standard that is pretty much across all jurisdictions. So it's one of the key drivers for data getting better. You've got the new data regulations that are coming in. If you comply properly with that, you will have accurate data. You will minimize data. You only keep data that you need. So I see these as a key driver, certainly with GDPR, for example. That ultimately will become a global reporting standard across the major jurisdictions. So if you lay that into how, the vision here, that must sit very nicely with the direction of travel, I would have thought.
Yes. Well, I think we need to see that there are many layers of data. And what I focus on is infrastructure, the basics, the bare basics.
Which are missing to a large extent
Pardon?
in a lot of institutions.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's a system that's going to evolve. Yeah, it's not going to change from now to next. And while it changes, we need to build a boat while swimming. So we need to continue swimming. And the higher levels of data, the more sophisticated reaches, they also need to be basically mastered. And at some point we will get there. So we will have more complex types of contracts, for instance, represented algorithmically, and all the relationships clear so we can extract even the most sophisticated statistic at once. And then people will invent other concepts that are even more sophisticated. I think we need to move on each layer at the way that each layer allows. And identification, for instance, and the basic representation of assets, of contracts and that kind of things, that needs to be done radically by law. There are 1,000 ways to skin the cat. And there's none that's better than the other. Yeah? It's just each one is a mousetrap. Yeah? So the value lies in the fact that we all do it the same way. And that's where law comes in. And on the higher levels, yes, reporting can drive some homogenization, some harmonization. And where I'm often at odds with my colleagues in the public sector institutions is that they talk about harmonization, they see it as a way to find wishy-washy agreements as well on things where we need to be crystal clear and rock hard. I think we need to have that harmonization process at the higher levels, but at the bottom, there should be no discussion. Yeah. There's technical. Or disagreement. Okay. Well then.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Frank, Francis, for delivering this very insightful presentation.
Thank you very much.